Dwain McFarland is the lead fantasy analyst and director of analytics at Fantasy Life. He previously spent time with Pro Football Focus, and he's best known for his awesome utilization report. He's a Texan, a dad, and he's just as big of a data nerd as I am. These are his late round perspectives. This episode is sponsored by Underdog. Underdog is the easiest place to play fantasy sports, and they give you a ton of different games and contests to choose from each week. If you think drafting is over because the season started, you'd be wrong. You can draft teams over there each week in literal minutes. Right now, if you sign up on Underdog with promo code LATEROUND, you not only get a deposit offer of up to $1,000, but you also get access to my rest of season rankings. Those will be emailed to you once you sign up. But when you sign up, you have to use promo code LATEROUND. Head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the app to do so. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show.
Appreciate getting to hang out with you a little bit. A couple years ago in Canton. Didn't get to go this year, but yeah, man, thanks for having me on.
I know, man. We missed you this past year at the expo. It was definitely I needed a little bit more data nerd support hanging out there at the stadium and such. But also for today's episode, earlier today I was getting ready and I was like, should I do my hair or should I wear a hat today? Because it's always a big question for me day to day is whether I'm just going to throw the hat on and not have to worry about anything. And I even got a haircut today, but
Come on, JJ. Let the people see your hair.
Look. I'm coming on a show with you, Mr. I mean, you look. I've done a show with Denny Carter for like a decade now with Living the Stream, and I have to deal with him having great hair all the time. You might be the 1A within the fantasy industry from a hair perspective, man. I mean, look at that thing.
I don't know. I appreciate it. I'll take whatever I can get. My wife's a hairstylist, so I'll just go with that. So
there we go. Okay, now it all makes sense.
I have to be on brand, as she says. Like my hair can't look bad, and that would be bad for her business, right? So we can't do that.
That's amazing that like I was thinking, like I went to the barbershop today, like I said earlier today, and it's a very standard barbershop kind of like situation where you're not facing the mirror, everyone's just chatting with each other. It's an amazing spot, right? And they've slowly learned like what I do for a living so that we talk football basically every time I'm in there and whatnot. But it would be, as much as I love being there, it would be pretty convenient if my wife just knew how to cut my hair.
Yeah, and it's funny. Sometimes my wife protests, though. She'll be like, no, you guys are coming to the salon. Other times she'll actually say, it's fine, I'll cut it at home. But I got to kind of gauge it and see.
Yeah.
She likes the lighting and the chair better at the salon. Sure. She's got all of her goods. The good scissors are there, JJ. The good clippers are there. The stuff that she's used a while and then she brings it home. That's the stuff that's here. And so, yeah. I like the convenience. But, if she says, you got to come up to the salon, I'm like, okay. Like I just do what she says.
I guess it's the equivalent of us like podcasting with like bad microphones or something like that, right? Like something along those lines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We could get through it, but yeah, it could be
right. Exactly. So look, I wanted to talk about a lot of stuff. I mean, I sent you a show sheet. We're going to get through a lot of things, but I didn't put on there, and I want to get to it though. Sort of like how you got to where you are now, because you've been around for a decent bit, but I know that it took a minute for you to kind of make the jump to be full-time in the space. And, you had another career beforehand. So can you let everyone know sort of like what that path was like? I like to ask my guests on late round perspectives that question.
Yeah, sure. Like many things in life, things come down to, hard work. You got to decide, is it something you really want to go for? But it also comes down to timing. It comes down to some luck, some good fortune, other people, treating you kindly and giving you favor and things. So, I mean, it's like all those things, right? It's not any one thing, but like my journey, I started off really just being someone who loved playing fantasy. Like that's really how it all started. And I slowly started kind of getting the high stakes bug about 12, 14 years ago. I started really getting into that realm and getting into these, sicko leagues where there's no one ever on the waiver wire. You got to be thinking multiple steps ahead. And I just loved it, because like that's kind of like where I feel like maybe I can grind out, an edge. And so I did pretty well at it. And so I was doing all this research anyway. I was doing all my research, that was like my hobby. I'd come home from work, hang out with the family or whatever. The way I would unwind is come in here and dive into spreadsheets and start researching. Like, does this matter? Does this matter? No, this doesn't matter. Should I use this in my process? Should I not? And just constantly tinkering with it and trying to figure it out. And then I decided, from my political world, from my corporate world, which was very political, by the way, which was the thing that drove me away from it. Like, I just got tired of office politics. I treated it like a game for a long time, and I was able to gamify it and have fun with it. But eventually I was just like, I can't do this anymore. Can we just make decisions and move forward? But anyway, I just got to a point where I was like, hey, we're in a really good spot financially. My wife and I talked about it for a really long time. If we ever met like ABC thresholds, we were at this certain point in our life, I would take a sabbatical. And so I did. And when I took that year away from the corporate world, I was able to really start writing. And that's when I was able to get my voice out there. And I was just doing it for fun. We were doing other things, but I was like, this will be something like to keep kind of, the creative juices flowing, still be productive, be doing some things I would like to do anyway. And I started writing about it, and I started off with a Fighting Chance fantasy. I remember Brian Drake on Twitter reached out to me. Hey man, you want to do a show? He had never even done a show before. I thought he just wanted to have me on for one show. No, it ended up being a show that we kept doing over and over. And Brian's awesome. So we, an Eagles fan and a Cowboys fan coming together and finding some common ground. And so that was the fantasy football hustle. We got that going, and people just liked it. And I mean, it did pretty well. So from there, I just kept writing, and then eventually Football Guys and Matt Waldman, I got to do some writing for them. Then that led to an opportunity with Establish the Run. And then that led ultimately, when I was back doing my full-time, job again, and back in the corporate world, in the political world, I got a call from PFF, and who I was just writing for part-time at that time. And they're like, hey, what if you could do this full-time? What if we could make you an offer? And I was like, well, here's the kind of offer I would need to make it work. And one thing led to another. And I honestly, man, I didn't know 5-6 years ago that I would get to do this full time. Yeah. I did eventually decide I was going to be dedicated enough that if the opportunity came up, like right time, right place, that it would be something I would want to do. But I didn't know if they would ever be able to support, when you start off, like I did over on the corporate side, and you work your way up, like, I mean, you kind of have a way of living that you like, you worked your way up already in one industry. And then so I had to take a big pay cut to go into fantasy football. Yeah. And you have a family too. Like that matters too, right? Like there's definitely a cost benefit to all of this of like, it's, I think a lot of people face that same dilemma, especially as they are not in their 20s anymore. Right. Like once you're out of that age range where like, that's when you can really easily take risks. I feel very lucky that when I was in my, I was only 3 years out of college, whenever I was like, I'm just going for this. I'm just going to do this, so it was low stakes. Like I always tell people, like the biggest question I had every week was, where am I going to get drunk? What bar am I going to go to, to party and hang out with friends this weekend? Right. Whereas now it's all about my kids and all, it's just a totally different set of responsibilities where it then becomes a lot harder to sort of make that leap. But look, man, we're very lucky to have you in the space because you do amazing work. Now you're at Fantasy Life, doing amazing stuff over there. How's that been? How has that transition been, going from PFF, which by the way, people don't realize this. I was at PFF for 3 months whenever my first year of doing analysis. It was just, a part-time, like I'm just trying to get my name out there kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And it was right before I got my full-time job at Numberfire. I was working under Ratcliffe and Clay. When that's a good duo to work under.
Yeah. I mean, but it was literally like I joke with Ratcliffe, and I joked with him about it. I think even on Perspectives, because he was on a couple weeks ago. But like I think I wrote 3 articles for it was like when Roddy White was a thing. Like it was a long time ago. But we at least have the PFF thing in common. But you made the jump from PFF to Fantasy Life. Like what has that been like? And it seems like just like the situation at Fantasy Life just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I mean, number one, like I've had great experiences everywhere I've worked. I've been really fortunate in this industry. Everybody has treated me really well, given me great opportunity to do things. They've given me latitude, and I had a really great time at PFF, which obviously fit with the way I think. And I love to have access to all that amazing data. And at PFF, I had data upon data upon data. Like I couldn't even get to all of it. There was so much, right? But the transition to fantasy life has been amazing. Matthew has been absolutely great to me. Elliot Christ, our CEO, he has been awesome. Like, we just have a really good leadership team. Now we have Dan Kaufman, who came over. He had formerly been at ESPN and The Athletic. And we've just grown like our talent base so much. I mean, when I came over, I was one of 5 people, and we were already awesome. Like, we already had Pete, Pete Overzet's one of the best. I love Pete, hilarious, but super smart and sharp guy. Right. Yes. Don't think he's just a funny guy. Like, Pete is smart and he's good and he's good at this stuff. He's very good at this stuff. And so we had Pete, we had myself, we had Kendall Valenzuela, we had a few other folks, but then it's just continued to grow. We added Ian Harditz, right? Then we had Matthew Friedman, and we've expanded our betting side, of things. And this year we added on the college side, we bring Thor over. So we just continue to grow. And again, I'm missing tons of people. When I started there were 5 of us. Now we're 30 full-time employees.
That's crazy, man.
So absolutely growing. I mean, we're growing the data side of it. We're growing all these different avenues. But man, it's been great. I couldn't have made, a better decision. Again, timing is everything. When Matthew reached out to me and Elliot reached out to me about this role, I was super happy at PFF. I had been at PFF a year. I thought my plan was, okay, let's give PFF 2 to 3 years. I like what I'm doing here, and then we'll be open. I didn't anticipate after a year that this sort of thing would happen. But when they came to me and they were like, hey, we're starting really a company almost from scratch, and here are the things we want to do. We want you to be part of it. Like, that's very exciting to me. So
yeah, I feel that. It's like whenever I left first off, I mean, when I left FanDuel, people are like, oh, JJ got fired from FanDuel. It's like, guys, stop. This is not, I wanted to change. I just wanted to switch things up. It wasn't that I was unhappy there. I just was wanting to do my own thing more. So it sounded like you were wanting to be there from the ground up as well at Fantasy Life. Now, you're doing all this data stuff over there. You're a data heavy analyst as I am myself. And you and I have had plenty of conversations, about different analysis or different data trends, what have you. My question I want to open up with, aside from your story within the space, but is what do you think that the masses sort of get wrong when it comes to data? Because we're in an era, I would say, where data is pretty accessible. Like, there's more and more stuff coming out that we didn't have 3 or 4 years ago at all. I mean, we didn't even know what kind of defensive personnel these teams were throwing out there. And we had very little data of like man versus zone and stuff like that. And now it's just, I mean, we're seeing so much stuff. So do you, like when you look at the landscape and you look at how people are consuming data and also how other analysts are using data, what do you think, instead of what they're doing right, what are they doing wrong?
So I would break this into like kind of 2 things, two categories. And wow, you picked a real zinger. Like, I could do the whole show just on this. Yeah. Like, I am a real sicko. All off season, I spend studying this stuff. Yeah. Trying to figure out what matters, what's noise. Okay, maybe it's kind of noise, maybe it kind of matters. What if I like weave it in with this other context? Now does it matter? Like, I spend so much time trying to chase all these things down. And honestly, it's what keeps me going. I love that stuff. Same. I love digging into that stuff, even though 98% of the time it leads to nothing. Yep. You learn something along the way, but there's not some big, pot of gold at the end of the damn rainbow where you're like, oh my God, I found like this one thing that's going to solve everybody's fantasy football questions. Like that's not out there. So you're just trying to incrementally get better. So I want to break it down into 2 buckets real quick. But the first bucket, just being generally like everyone, what I think is going on that people are getting wrong. And this is more for like people that are listening that just love playing fantasy football, but it also applies to the analysts. And then I want to talk about that second part real quick that you mentioned, which is where we are with data and advanced data and where it's going and some of the things I see there. But the first part, right, and it just plays so easily right now because we are at the beginning of the season. But number one is that people think they need to be so polarizing in their takes. Mm-hmm. And look, it is an industry. I get it. We're all creating content. We all know that there is a game that has to be played to get people to listen, to get people to click on things. I understand all of those things. Like, I spend time, guys, researching those things too. I mean, I try to be good at all aspects of my job. I want to reach as many people as I can. I've tried to adapt the way that I present information to really be able to get it to more people. But what I would say is the way you free yourself in this space is to realize that everything is really a range of outcomes. Yes. And I have 2 examples. that we can work through, that people can actually apply and use these two players today. I'm going to ask you a question, JJ.
Okay. All right.
Let's start with Garrett Wilson. Is Garrett Wilson a buy low or a sell low? He can't be a sell high. Is he a sell low? What is Garrett Wilson to you right now?
You know what's really funny? You bring that up. And last week on the 15 Transaction Show and the newsletter that I write, I talked about Garrett Wilson, and the headline was that he was a sell last week, right? So before that game against the Broncos, because obviously the schedule, if you look at the next month, right, the schedule is not, when you count the Broncos game, the schedule didn't look very good, right? So we're sitting here and like peripherals wise, not bad, right? Like things aren't looking horrible for him from, 28% target share. The offense should hypothetically get a little bit better, but now you have this new wrench of Devontae Adams and what could happen there. And so to me, to your point, probably, I think that there is a wide range of buying and selling with Garrett Wilson to the point where there is not a singular answer. My stance last week, if I were to just go with that, was that Wilson was a sell if you needed that immediate production, if you needed to win, and you started 0-3, you weren't feeling good about your squad. Second half of the season, this is pre-Devontae Adams, trade rumors and stuff. But second half of the season, if you're getting a 28% target share from a really good prospect where we have a pretty good backbone of him being at least a well above average wide receiver, that's going to hit eventually, especially in better matchups, right? So it was more of a second half of the year buy, immediate sell. That's kind of the way that I looked at it.
Now, look, you're actually being rational here, and you just kind of gave a band of things that could really happen and different caveats and all those things. The problem is, right, people just want the soundbite.
That's right.
Sell him high or sell him, or what do I do? Do I go buy him or am I selling him? Which am I doing? And what you hit on is really important, because if you look at like his profile, and let's take the things that we know wide receivers own. They own their target share. They own their air yard share. Are there other factors? Of course there are. Right. In any one game, they may not own hardly any of that, but like over the course of their career, over the course of a season, over a larger sample, they own that. And so one of the things I did this offseason, I created the utilization score. And while it says utilization, like there are talent components built into it, because we know that the player's talent, and guess what? Fantasy points are built into it, because fantasy points, guys, as much as you may hear people talk about a lot of things, do you know how hard it is to have a metric that's actually more predictive than fantasy points?
Exactly.
It's not easy.
Exactly.
It's really the gold standard. It's like if you're going to do something with NFL draft, you at least need to be able to beat NFL draft capital. That's how I think about fantasy points. And so with the utilization report, it actually counts fantasy points in, because it acknowledges there are outliers that can be good or bad based on history and probabilities. And so let me just tell you real quick with Garrett Wilson, I went ahead and isolated it down to the things that I knew you were going to talk about. Target share, air yard share. Why? Because you've done your research and you know what things matter. But here are the percentage of players that have finished as a wide receiver 1 that had those similar data points to Garrett Wilson going back to 2011. 70%. 70% of them were wide receiver 1s. Okay. Wow. 14% of them finished as a wide receiver 2. 14% of them finished as a wide receiver 3, and 2%, there's a small portion, finished as a wide receiver 4. Right. So what that tells me is there's really a range of outcomes here, but the way I want to think about Garrett Wilson, and let's set aside the Devontae Adams thing, that's a real thing. Like we would need to talk about that. Right. If we just set that aside for right now and pretend like that's not even a factor, what that tells me is, okay, at worst, I want to sell Garrett Wilson as a wide receiver 2, and I'm probably being kind, giving him away at that price. But let's say I'm just done with the experience. I can't freaking take it anymore, man. Well, okay, sell him as a wide receiver 2, but don't sell him as a wide receiver 3. Right. It's probably not happening. And like, if you still like him, then hold for a high-end wide receiver 2, not just any wide receiver 2.
Right.
And if you're going to buy him, you're probably profiting anywhere from a price similar to a low-end wide receiver 2 to mid-range wide receiver 2. You're probably profiting. We can't guarantee you're going to profit, but we're grinding out these trades as if, and I know this doesn't work perfectly, but you're making fantasy trades all the time, every year. And you have to keep the big picture in mind from a probability standpoint. But there's a flip side of this. Like, so for me, Garrett Wilson, like there's a range there. And depending on where you are, what your team needs, how other people value him in your league, he might be a sell, he might be a buy, because there's a range. But if you understand that, you can be adaptable and you can know what the best move is for you instead of just saying, oh, well, somebody told me to buy low or sell high. You know how this goes. People don't see the low or the high. They see sell or buy.
Exactly.
I get screenshots. Dude, look at the trade I pulled off. And I'm like, that's terrible.
Yeah. Right.
Did you miss the low part of buy low?
Yeah.
You paid for Garrett Wilson like he was a high-end wide receiver one. Well, you said all this data sets. I know, but I still told you to go buy him as a wide receiver two.
Right.
So let's do one more.
Okay.
And I'm gonna go with you here, JJ. Let's Jaden Reed. What would you say to do with Jaden Reed? Is he a buy low or a sell high?
Can I say that he's look, hypothetically speaking, he's a massive regression candidate, right? Like his peripherals, he's got what, like an 18.5% target share or something on the season. It's an offense that we know spreads things out. I also though don't know if from a market perspective, like from a production standpoint, to where he'll likely finish, he would be a sell. Like how he's produced with Jordan Love, let's say. No, forget about the non-Jordan Love games. So if you're assuming that he's going to be like a 25 PPR point per game wide receiver, sell, of course.
Right.
My thing is, I do rest of season rankings every week, and I think that Jaden Reed is a good player who's going to be above, because, as we look at like regression, I mean, you know this better than anyone. As we look at regression, there are going to be players every year who buck regression trends to some degree, right? Like not to like an insane degree, but and I'm not even saying that Jaden Reed's going to be like Tyreek Hill, but guys from like an expected touchdown perspective and such, like when you're good and you will be better than what that norm is and what that average is.
You can't regress a player like Jaden Reed to the NFL average.
Right, to the same way that you would regress Alec Pierce or something, right?
Yes.
Like it's different. With that being said, to me, Jaden Reed is more so of a hold than anything else, right? As like an actionable thing. I only say that because I don't know if the market has realized his talent totally, right? But I would imagine that a lot of, formulaic ways of looking at it would call him a sell.
Yeah. And so look, again, you're being very reasonable. And the answer is he could be either. So let's just take a look like at his comps. Well, number one, he's scoring, when we look at 19.7 fantasy points per game, but he's got a utilization score. He ranks 34th. It's a 6.6. Historically, that's average 12.4 points per game. But like, that's only part of the story, right? It's like, okay, what are those ranges of outcomes on Jaden Reed? And whenever we really dig into, his profile and we start to say, okay, what might this player be? You can't completely ignore the fact that he has scored nearly 20 fantasy points per game.
Right.
Because we see, to your point, players that are outliers. We know that there are the guys that come in, the 15% of players that, despite the fact he's under an 80% route participation, despite the fact that right now his targets per route run is only 21%, those things are both wide receiver 3 territory.
Yeah, right.
But we do also know, and like last year, the quickest thing I can think of is running backs, right? Achan.
Yep.
If you had Achan, it didn't really matter if he was in a split backfield. You wanted to play him. Jahmyr Gibbs, Alvin Kamara, when we go back to his breakout season when he was still sharing the backfield with Mark Ingram, we have these guys that every year that are so good, and you turn them on and you watch it and you're like, okay, like they're really good at football. But also I know he's not going to average 20 yards per reception and 15 yards per rush the rest of the season because like it's just not possible. But what do I regress him to? To like what? Like Deebo Samuel territory? I mean, where am I putting this? So I dug a little deeper on this one, JJ. And so going back to 2011, if we look at guys that were between a 70 and 80% route participation, because I think they're going to kind of keep him there because they play him in the slot. They don't. It could get better. It could get better, but we've got 4 games. That's what they're doing with him. Okay. They did it with him last year too. If we look at guys that are between 18 and 23% targets per route run, okay, and I use that to normalize because target share is not really fair because he's not on the field enough. Targets per route run is the better way to look at a player in a part-time role. And then his air yard share, 15 to 25% is where I put it. Right now at this year, he's like at 18 or 19% for the team, okay? But I also said he's getting rushing attempts. So we got to have somebody getting 3 to 10%. And his 4 comps, Curtis Samuel, 14.1 fantasy points per game. That was wide receiver 26 in 2020. Deebo Samuel twice, 2019, 2023, that's 16.2 and 12.6 fantasy points per game. So that's wide receiver 12 and 33 respectively. And then Ted Ginn Jr., I was mostly just adding that for Ian Harditz because I was on a show with him and he loves the freaking Ohio State Buckeyes. Yeah. That's back to 2007. I broke the 2011 barrier just to go add Ted Ginn for Ian. 10.2 fantasy points per game. So, like, look, when you average that together, it's 13.3. That's a wide receiver 32. So my truth on Jayden Reed is I bet he doesn't finish as a wide receiver 1 this season, but I'm not going to go as low to push him down to a wide receiver 3. Debo's my favorite one in there because Debo had those two kind of different years. One as a wide receiver 3, one as a wide receiver 2, and a lot of the same arguments existed. People saying, man, he can never keep this yak up. Well, he's been doing the yak thing for 3 years now, or 4 years.
Exactly.
And he's keeping it up because we couldn't regress Debo to a normal yak. We didn't know what to regress him to yet, because we didn't know who Debo was, but now you regress Debo to Debo. Yes. And that could be the case, to your point, for a player, like what we're talking about with this. So I would say wide receiver 2 is what he probably ends the year as.
That's yes. And to be fair, that's where I have him ranked right now. And I was surprised because what I do with my rest of season rankings every week, I put them together and then I download what Fantasy Pros is doing and what the analysts there are saying, and I just compare and contrast because it helps it helps me see where I'm higher and lower on and not be influenced while I'm actually doing, the actual rankings. Jayden Reed was like at the time when I did it earlier this week, was at like wide receiver 25, 26 or something along those lines. I was kind of shocked by that because I had him in that like 15, 16 range, like in the like mid wide receiver 2. I also think again, of course, the regression stuff is there, and what you're talking about from a comps perspective was just really interesting, especially with like the Debo stuff because he kind of plays that ish role for Green Bay. We are in a situation right now, though, in the NFL where there are so few haves and so many have-nots with NFL offenses that when you can attach a good, talented player, and I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yep.
When you can attach a good, talented player like Reed, even knowing regression is coming. And we almost, I felt this way about Dwain McFarland last year too, where not to say that like Jayden Reed is going to break efficiency marks like Dwain McFarland did, but when you have only a handful that you can really pick out in the NFL, handful of offenses, and you say, okay, we know that Jayden Reed's a talented guy, right? I mean, I liked him as a prospect. He showed up in year 1. He had great peripherals in year 1. And he's already doing what he's doing in year 2, right? So far, small sample. But when you have that talent and you're associating it with what should be a top 5 to 7 offense in the league, and you know that the drop-off from that offense to even an average offense at this point is pretty immense, that alone makes me nervous about actually pulling the trigger with a regression type sell with a player like this. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And I think that's where the range again becomes so important because really Jayden Reed could be a sell or a buy.
Right.
If someone is willing to pay me, they think he's going to average 19 fantasy points per game and they're going to pay me a high-end wide receiver 1 price to come get Jayden Reed from me, I'm going to take the deal.
Yeah.
If someone wants to offer me a low-end wide receiver 2 or a high-end wide receiver 3 return on Jayden Reed, I'm not taking it.
Yeah.
I'm going to just stick with what I have, and I'm going to ride it out, and I'm just going to enjoy having fun just watching the dude play football. That's the other fun part about what we do. So it really comes down to like that range, and I think you did a really good job of painting the picture, and one of the components surely, for sure, like it is the quality of the offense. Like this actually leads into like the other question that you had after this one for me, but I know we had one other component to this one, but the quality of the offense absolutely matters, especially in a year where we're seeing that offenses have not found the counterpunch to what defenses are doing yet. Right. And so it's even more important this season.
Yes.
So just real quick, we can quickly touch on the other components. So
I think we should talk. We should talk about this as long. People will rather us talk about this than freaking Trey Sermon or whoever. So let's
okay. Well, dude, I love this kind of show.
Me too, man. Me too. Yeah, keep rolling with it.
Yeah. So but to take it to the other component you're asking about, which is, and if you want to keep pulling that other thread we were just on, we can. But where I was going to go is like all the advanced data.
Yes.
Right. And so first of all, I want to bring this back to we are still in an industry where everyone is trying to find their niche. Everyone is trying to find their angle. Everyone is trying to get people to watch their content, people to read their content, people to pay for their subscription. Like it's the nature of the game. But I think when we get into that, there is like a slippery slope that can be a bit dangerous, and it can cause people to want to overstate things. And I'm not even saying that people are intentionally doing this or even thinking of all those things I just said. I just know that people are thinking, I want to be good at this. I want people to like my work. I want to do something different than what other people do. And it's not always meant with like malintent or, oh, I'm pulling the wool over people's
I think it rarely is. Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, I think it rarely is. But what I found is when I researched most of those things, you brought up coverage. That's a great one. Because when I was at PFF, man, I went so deep in the weeds on this coverage stuff because at the time, I had access to stuff that most people didn't have access to, period. Right. It's much more available now. But man, I got to spend so much time with PFF, and they've studied it so much, like how all these modifiers and coverage work. For example, most zone coverage isn't even really zone coverage. Like half of it's probably man coverage. The backdoor coverage is at least man coverage. And like, so there's a lot of issues with the coverage data because one, it's not necessarily sticky week over week. It's not even always sticky season over season. You have to find situations where you've got a consistent coordinator. They've got similar personnel to what they had last year. Were they successful with that last year? And even then, they change their game plans based on who they're playing. And some coaches do that more than others, just like on offense. Some offensive coaches are like, this is what we do. We're going to do it every week. Other coaches are like, no, we're going to look like not a completely different team, but we're going to have a very different plan for the way we're going to attack team A versus what we're going to do with team B. And so what I found in researching that data is that there were great examples, JJ, where you could use it. And so I did start incorporating it into my writing, and people can actually go back and look at my old articles, and you'll see the point at which you'll realize that I actually completed all the back end research because I was talking about it quite a lot.
Yeah.
And it was a cool, interesting thing. And I was studying it on the fly and I was really interested in it. But then there comes a point where all of a sudden you see me only talking about it a few times per week. And the reason why, it's really just the outlier scenarios that matter for the coverage. Do you have a truly man heavy team? Most teams, 70% of the league's running zone. And again, the way you qualify zone, man, there is so much nuance to it, and they can be so cover 3 for one team and what you're getting versus cover 3 and another team can be honestly complete opposite things.
Yeah.
Depending on what they're running and the modifiers within their system. Like, dude, I'm telling you, when I started researching this stuff and I got this booklet from PFF, because guys, believe it or not, you can bang on PFF all you want. They talk to coaches.
Yeah.
That's how they figure out, how do we chart this play? What does this mean? They have coaches consulting them, and then they train the people on how to go collect the data. Does every data collector do a perfect job? No, some are better than others, just like anything. Yeah. But the point being, man, there's so much nuance to this stuff. So really what you're looking for, A, is that. Is there a strong tendency from a coverage perspective? And you know what, man? I'm seeing stuff on Twitter right now. We're 4 weeks into a season.
I know, man. With
a new coordinator, and I'm hearing, man, and because I get people responding to me, man, I'm worried about his matchup on the inside against the zone. I'm like, what are we talking about?
Yeah.
I don't know what we're talking about. This does not matter.
Yeah.
It might matter, but we can't predict whether it will or not. Not yet. Now, if you've got a strong coordinator tendency, and then you've got a team like the 49ers, there's a multi-year trend with the 49ers. When you get man coverage, they prefer going to Brandon Ayuk. When they get zone coverage, they prefer going to Deebo Samuel. But the problem is, are you actually facing a team that week where you can even use that information? Because there's a blob of teams that are all together. They all are kind of doing the same thing. So that means I can write about that thing with Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk like 4 times a year.
Yeah.
Because the matchup actually lines up where I'm like, oh, this matters this week.
Yeah, right. And I mean, the same to me, the way that I look at matchups each week and like how I'm adjusting for, because, there's things like fantasy points allowed and stuff that we at a high level are just naturally looking at just to see what's happened historically. I always, within the sample that we're working with, but I always am approaching matchup related things with in the back of my head idea of this cornerback matchup or this but that generally comes out still in the team level trends that you will be looking at anyway, right? So like, for instance, we know that there's going to be a potential individual matchup between whoever's facing Denver and Pat Surtain and the potential X on that team or whoever that top wide receiver is on that team. Number one, it's not a guarantee that he's going to see every single snap against that wide receiver, which is part of the problem that we run into at times with like cornerback wide receiver stuff, is that the fact that I think that there's this idea out there that all of these top corners are automatically shadowing, right? All these, and they don't, right? That's just not what happens. But regardless of that, because you have that corner, right? Because you have Pat Surtain, and you look at how Denver has defended in general, but also wide receivers, it's coming out in that team level data anyway.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, yes, it's a bad individual matchup, but it's a bad team matchup. Like, you can still, that's why a lot of the stuff that I'm looking at is just like the throwaway. Number one, you should always lead. This is how I approach it. I'm always leading with the offense and the player himself, right? Yes. The role that he plays, the volume that he sees, that usage is what's going to be most important, because offenses are going to be dictating games and their individual game plan, generally speaking. If there is a situation where we know in general a defense isn't performing well against the slot, I'm not saying just like this individual matchup, man versus zone, what have you. I'm saying literally just like this team has been attacked in the middle of the field historically so far to start the season, or, last year, what have you. And that's a general look at how that defense might be defending these wide receivers. Just as Denver is the toughest matchup right now, and fantasy points allowed, adjusted fantasy points allowed, however you look at it, against wide receivers. So whatever wide receiver they're facing, it's not just a Pat Surtain thing. This is a, number one, you don't know factually how many snaps he's going to play opposite of, Jacoby Myers or whoever it is. But number two, in general, this is going to be a tough unit to probably pass on at this point, right? And I think that's where people can get into trouble, because they start to overthink things a little bit. And I'm guilty of it. I think you and I probably too. Like, it's very easy. And it's the meme of like the one
sitting on your brain.
Yeah, right.
It's
like
so big.
You exactly. You go from the point of like some very surface level take, and then there's the take, and then you start researching and you start to overthink it, and then at the end, after you research, you realize, oh, it really was just that surface level take that was right. And I do think there is plenty of paralysis by overanalysis within this space and within what I'm doing or you're doing. It's very easy to fall into that trap. And I think that that needs to be said more, is that when you see something online or you see something in a tweet, like if you look at someone's, this happened earlier this week where there was a comparison of someone's yards per route run, one wide receiver to the other. Someone in the Discord, in the Late Round Fantasy Football Discord, posted it while I was doing a live stream for patron members, and I started to rant against it because there wasn't context around what the yards per route run actually meant. Like for instance, like I love Drake London, and I liked him as a prospect and all of that, but we also know inherently that when there's going to be less competition on a team, like if you had a team that had Tyreek Hill and Justin Jefferson on the same team, and you're looking at a wide receiver 3 on that team, that wide receiver 3 could be Jaden Reed, and his yards per route run's not going to look very good because it's competing with Tyreek Hill and Justin Jefferson. You can't just look at the raw numbers and say definitively, this guy's better than this guy. I think that's where, and it goes back to your original point of like being way too concrete with the stances and the takes that we have, and not thinking enough about just the contextual stuff and like the range of outcomes with this stuff.
Yeah. And I think, the matchup stuff just lend themselves to it naturally. And I want to be really clear. There are people doing fabulous work on these fronts.
Yes.
And I love the fact that we're getting all this new data. I love the fact that we're pushing the bounds, and that like we continue to improve and improve and improve. And I think at some point, like we probably are going to have some realizations that, are kind of aha moments for us where we find an improvement in what we're doing. But where I do think there is a lot of danger is with the matchup stuff. And I really only care about the extremes. Like basically, are you playing the Commanders or not? If you're playing the Commanders, they sucked last year. They sucked this year. I can look across. They don't have a good cornerback. No offense, St. Juiced. I know you're out there doing your best. They try to shadow you some. You're doing what you can, man. Which is better than what I can do. I'm not on the NFL field trying to cover anyone, because I would be terrible at that. That would be a yards per route run of 2,000. So, I mean, there again, it's a larger sample I can tie to the Commanders, and it's an extreme. And we're now at 4 weeks, so we have some other teams that are starting to work their way in there, like the Rams, and there are some where I'm like, okay, like this is worth a little bit of bump. But again, if you're looking at odds makers and what's happening in Vegas, and then once that line gets beat up and those team totals get beat up, they're also really already telling you all that. They're already telling you the offenses they think are going to stink for the week when th're sitting there with, a team total of 18, and you're used to seeing them at a 24.
Right.
It's probably because the defense they're playing is good. So that would be the other thing I would say is don't double count.
Right.
Don't start double counting all those things and moving players down your ranks or up your ranks like multiple times.
I was about to say that, like the Rams, for instance, I talked about this on my sleeper show. The Rams have been very bad against perimeter receivers to start the year, right? Yep. Does that mean that all of a sudden you're going to rank Romeo Doubs and Dontavian Wicks ahead of Jaden Reed this week because they're poorer against? No, you're still going to have Jaden Reed ahead of those guys, more than likely, because of all the stuff that we talked about earlier with Reed himself. But it's more so like we can look at a good slot matchup. Well, if the offense doesn't have a very reliable slot receiver, you're not just going to force the issue. Matter. Yeah, right. It doesn't matter enough. So like we can call out the fact that, like, to me, it's more so like the Steelers, for instance, they've been really bad against slot. I call them out all the time because they've been horrible against slot wideouts for like a decade. Like it's a very common Mike Tomlin driven thing that has gone on for a long time. Right?
It can also be like inducing the run. It's like, we want you to throw it to your slot.
You're right.
receiver.
Exactly.
We want to take away these other things, and we think we'll take our chances with you doing this.
Right. And then so week 1 happens, right? So to me, sometimes that kind of data is just as impactful when you look at it in hindsight as when you're looking at it to forecast. Now, what I mean by that is, you look at week 1, Ray McLeod had a decent game against Pittsburgh back in week 1, as Atlanta's slot guy. And then everyone's freaking out about Drake London because his numbers weren't very strong. But you can look in hindsight and say, okay, there's at least a piece of this narrative for Drake London. Not the only story, not the only reason that's happened, but at least a piece as to why it happened of Drake London not performing as well, maybe because it was matchup driven. Joey Porter Jr. is a really good cornerback, and the Steelers have been historically pretty bad against the slot, so they're attacking the slot, and Kirk Cousins right now maybe doesn't have all of his arm strength back. Like you can just start to piece these things together to then say this could be why, as opposed to just saying this is why. I think that's the big difference with how folks are kind of looking at this stuff.
Yeah, and especially like early in the year, guys, like especially week 1. Like the Isaiah Likely craze was insane. And I remember putting out my adjusted projections the next day for the Ravens and just getting lit up on social, which I knew was going to happen. So it's fine. Of course. Like, whatever. Don't care. Okay. Like go ahead. Like, and sometimes like I get questions on like, I didn't think about that. Maybe I should rethink my stance. But so many people came to me and they're like, dude, he's already, whatever it was, he got like 9 receptions on the year. There's no way he's finishing with under, 60. Cause I think I had him at like low 50s. Yeah. I'm like, guys, you do realize what just happened, right? As far as we know, Isaiah Likely, we go back, we look at his career. He's had multiple opportunities without Mark Andrews on the field when the Ravens still needed a number 2 passing option. We've seen some games kind of close to what we saw in week 1, and then we've seen other games be complete duds. So as far as I know right now, he just had a spike game in week 1.
Right.
But he's a young player who has done some things. He plays at a position where sometimes it takes a few years to string together consistent, outcomes. So I am going to bump him up a little bit. And I'm going to say, let's call him a borderline tight end 1 now. Right. I'm still going to keep Mark Andrews ahead of him. But at the same time, I know that there's a chance he could be getting better. But there's also this chance that it's really just another game like we've seen from Isaiah Likely in the past. No, people can't stand that. It's like, no, man, you're an idiot. You didn't watch the game. He's the tight end 1. In fact, he should be a top 5 tight end if we draft it today. Again, guys, that's with the hyper super polar takes that we don't have to take. That doesn't help you.
Right.
It doesn't help you to think in those terms, in my opinion. It helps you to know what the polar ends are of what could happen. And it could be him as a tight end 5. But really, you got to step back and think, what are the probabilities of it? Like, what does the data tell us? And that's what I really try to do, honestly, in my content, is like paint that picture as easily as I can. And what's funny, dude, about matchups, my matchup articles have gotten more and more simple over the years.
Same.
I have taken stuff out of my matchup columns versus adding more things in. And it's based on the offseason research. You hit it perfectly. You said the player and their role is the number 1 driver. If you go look at correlation to future fantasy success, just looking at week after week after week after week after week over the last 3 years of data, the number 1 correlated thing to a receiver getting yards, a quarterback getting yards, a running back getting yards, it's the yards they've already been getting coming into that game. By far. Yeah. It's over 2x as important as their defensive matchup.
Yep.
Now, there are outliers. There really are outlier defenses, good and bad, where it will cause me to adjust that take more.
Yes.
But 80 to 90%, I don't even mess with it.
Right.
They're just falling in the middle somewhere.
Right.
So, and I tested it against team totals. I tested it against defense. I did defensive yards allowed, EPA. I mean, everything you can imagine, defensive success rate. Like sometimes I read these articles and they're really great and it's good context, but I'm like, what is even the point? Like I got 74 stats in front of me, but what does it all mean? And to your point, usually the really good defense, all I had to do is look at, man, they're giving up 60 yards per game rushing.
Yeah, right. Yeah. They're
like, here we are.
Yeah.
I do think the biggest edge is injuries. Understanding injuries and defense. If you've got a decimated defensive line and you've got an offense that's built to take advantage of that matchup, meaning they don't have a ton of injuries on their offensive line, they've got a healthy offensive line with some good players on it, like that can be a thing. Yeah. Like that can really be a thing. You got a team like the Cowboys have no pass rush. That definitely matters for Justin Fields this weekend. No Micah Parsons, no DeMarcus Lawrence. Like that matters. I think some of the bigger stuff we should be talking about are really injuries, especially whenever the starter that was in before was actually good. Yes. Now, if it's an injury to a starter that wasn't any good and now it's a backup, it's like
they might even be better.
He might be better.
He
might be better.
Exactly. You know, the other point that you were making though about, you know, look, there's a lot of good analysis, like you've been saying, that's looking at really interesting data points and is being concise and clear in what they're saying. And this isn't us like saying that we know more than others when it comes to the analysis. It's actually quite the opposite, in my opinion. It's more so us saying that we don't know enough right now, and so let's approach this in a way where we know we don't know a lot, right? Like where we're open to a lot of different outcomes in this case. And I also think though that it's very easy, you know, I've fallen into this trap plenty as an analyst. It's very easy to have confirmation bias based on results of whatever you were analyzing and looking at, and then thinking that, oh, because this happened, I can just repeat this process over and over again and get the same results, when that's really not what happens often. I found this to be the case a lot with, and I know that you do. I love that we're not even remotely getting to any of the stuff on the show sheet. This is exactly what I want for this kind of show. But I know that you do a lot of prospecting work, right? Like you have a model that you look at and whatnot, and I do too. And one of the things that it doesn't irritate me, that's too strong of a word. It's more so of a critique that I get year in and year out, is that my ratings for these prospects align too closely to draft capital, and that there's not enough of a range. You know, like if I really liked a guy, he should be way, way higher than what I'm actually saying because I'm anchored to draft capital too much, right? And then I've seen other models out there who I look at the results post-draft and I just cannot fathom how the results are what they look like, because draft, you know, they have a 4th round wide receiver, or 5th round wide receiver ranked as the wide receiver 3 in the class. And I'm like, this is just not a logical thing to do based on the stuff that I've researched and being anchored to draft capital in some way. And a lot of it is overfitting, right? A lot of it is when you're testing these models, you're looking at them and you're saying, oh, this correlates really, really strongly, and I'm just going to keep throwing more and more data into this model in order for it to get a stronger correlation. And all of a sudden you have what you think, what you think is a really good model, but in reality, all you're doing is making it just stronger based on what you've seen historically, and you're not testing the proper metrics if I were to dumb that down. And so I do think that that's part of this too, is that when you look at the results, if you're building a model tomorrow, prospect model, and you view the results and you're like, man, this looks good. I even tested it. The R-squared's looking pretty good. If it's a, you know, linear regression type model, you're like, man, this is good. I can move forward with this. Just make sure that you're testing properly, because there's a lot of things that you can test for to make sure, you know, the individual metrics that you're throwing into that model, you can test to see if those are correlated, and if they are, and then you're double counting, like you said. And that happens so frequently. And my fear is that it's also going to trickle into some of this weekly matchup stuff that we're looking at.
It already is.
Yeah, where we're just double counting things over and over again.
Yeah. And it's really, I think that what you just brought up is the key. what you do is you start testing these variables, not just to like your endpoint of whatever it is, projected fantasy points or expected,
Right.
What you think they're going to score in fantasy points the next week's, the next rolling for, whatever the case may be, and whatever you're testing for. Like, you want to make sure that your variables, you're testing their dependency on one another, and when you get things that are very closely aligned, and you think logically about it too, like, it'll make sense to you most of the time that I could see how these two things being very closely correlated probably is double counting when I think through it. Yes. There are some times you can get a strong correlation between two things that aren't really double counting. And you kind of have to use your own logic and what you know about football or whatever it is. Doesn't matter, whatever topic it is, like whatever thing we're researching in life, like, you've got to use your brain for it. But what I would say, is the simplicity of it. Like, the more simple I can keep it, like the better, in my opinion. Plus 100%. That also helps me continue to go back and test it and understand where it went wrong, where it did well. It needs to be as complex as it needs to be. Right. I mean, I'm not saying you can't have a complex model that can't be really good, but I think it's just me personally, I found the more complex I've made it, the harder it makes for me to go back and retest it over time and really figure out how do I improve it. So, I mean, that's one of the other advantages, in my opinion, to trying to do a little bit less or more. The other thing is, there are just trade-offs. Like, I've talked about this in the utilization score that just came out. Like, I could have made the correlation to future fantasy points and the utilization score even stronger, but that wasn't my number one goal. I wanted to have something stronger than fantasy points, but I wanted something that had stability. I wanted something that wasn't just a bunch of double counting. There were things that I actually like, because we go back and forth, we talk about it. We have other people that are better than math at me, and like, we have these conversations behind the scenes. And I was pretty adamant about certain things coming out, and it actually took down the predictive nature, but it made it more stable.
Right.
Because it's early, it's in its infancy. It's based on 4 years of data, based on our partnership with PFF. And I just wanted to leave room to allow it to breathe. It accomplished its goal, right? It's doing things that are different than expected fantasy points. It's complementary to fantasy points themselves. Like, it can be a really good tool, but at the same time, I didn't just want to come in and, I mean, I could have just built it to where it was like, it came in like above fantasy points by like, 10, so like an R squared for fantasy points, I'm trying to remember now, was like a 0.55 or something. It was like a 0.62, something like, but I could have made it like a 0.7. But when I started like looking at all these things, I was like, man, this doesn't make sense. And I wanted to make it something stable as well. So I think like, and the same thing with the models for the rookie stuff. And it can be such an easy trap to fall into. And I did this early in my career, just trying to chase that higher and higher and higher. And I do think that it's an evolution that happens with you, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and you 100%. Start learning things, and you start getting better and gaining perspectives that you didn't have before.
Yes. I was actually going to say that exact same thing. I think the one thing that forces you to go with a more simple, simpler approach with data is experience, and is the fact that you went out on a limb on a player that you should have never gone out on a limb with, and you got roasted for it, and it forces you to go back and say, why was I stupid with this? Like what went wrong? And you're like, oh, well, I probably overinflated this one singular metric when I probably shouldn't have done that, or I did this, or I did this. So I do think that, as people get reps, whether you're an analyst or a player yourself, like I get emails probably once a week from people saying, how do I start when I'm building a model? Like, where do I go? Like, what do I, and to me, a lot of it is just start messing around, like just start gathering data and start
get a question you want to answer.
Yeah,
like
right. Exactly.
What's the question you want to answer? It's like a scientific, it's just like going back to school, guys. It's like, okay, what's the problem?
Yes.
Like, what's the thing? What's my hypothesis? Right? Okay, great. What are the variables? Now I'm going to go test all those things, and I'm going to compare it to like what my hypothesis was.
Yes.
Like, it's just literally the scientific, methodology. You just work through that.
Yes.
You have a question you start with.
So another, since we're talking like kind of high level and just kind of game theory stuff and data stuff and whatnot, I do want to ask you what your rule of thumb has been throughout your playing career with free agent budget. And I ask that because I get questions every week during my live streams for Patreon of what % FOB should I spend to get X player? And I'm not going to lie, it kind of drives me nuts. Like because we go around and content out there gives you a FOB recommendation, right? But a recommendation for how much you should be bidding on a player it can't be a blanketed thing. It has to be so catered to your league, to your structure, to your needs, like so many different things. I can give you a general range, sure, but I just don't know how helpful it is. Like, am I wrong in thinking about this and being tilted about the way that people approach that stuff?
I don't think you're tilted. And I have a pretty refined process for it. Like, I'll walk through it.
Yeah, let's hear it.
But it's still because there are variables that we're going to talk about. But yeah. So my process is just like what you talked about for projecting a player for the week or the rest of the season. We're starting with the player. Okay.
Right.
So we're looking at the player. How talented do we think they are? We don't have to go into what all those variables are, but if you listen to JJ, you know what they are for the different positions. Like we're very aligned in a lot of the research that we've done.
Yeah.
So you know what talent looks like. You know whether or not the player's shown it in the past. But so when we're talking about grading the player, we use 1 to 5 stars at fantasy. So here are the components: talent. What's the opportunity that the player has? What's the quality of the team environment? What you just talked about earlier with the Packers and with Jaden Reed, that matters. And then what's the last part? It's time horizon. Okay. So how long do we expect to have this player for? Is this a very talented player on a really good team that's now locked into a role for the rest of the season? That's a 5-star player.
Yeah.
That player can enter almost any fantasy lineup and be a starter from day one. Maybe not an 8-team league. There are always exceptions, but for the most part, a 5-star player can step into someone's, at least their flex position, but in most leagues, like right into a wide receiver 2, running back 2 spot, depending on if you're hurting, they might be your running back 1 immediately.
Yeah.
James Conner goes down tomorrow. Trey Benson fits this.
Yes.
Right. I mean, that's what it is. It's a good enough offense and we like the player. If it's something where it's like, okay, the player is going to get a chance here for 2 to 4 weeks. Let's take Dontavian Wicks. Yeah. Dontavian Wicks is a great player to work through this process. The talent, I don't have a super huge sample, but I liked him didn't love him, liked him as a prospect. Really liked the small sample last year. Liked the small sample we got this year. I put it all together. I have to look at him and say, he's probably talented.
Yeah.
I could end up being wrong because it is a small sample, but I'm going to go ahead and go with this is probably a talented player. But time horizon is the tricky part for him.
Yeah.
Christian Watson, high ankle sprain, looked pretty terrible to me, but I'm no doctor.
Yeah.
Christian Watson probably out at least 1 week, maybe 2, but it could be 4, 5, or 6. But then I look at the next 2 games and I look at the matchups.
Yeah.
For the Packers, I'm like, okay, Dontavian Wicks, very talented player. He has an opportunity right now to take the job.
Right.
So that's a 4-star player for me. And it can be tough. Some people might call that more of a 3. And I tell our other people that do these, we talk through all this. I was like, here's how I've always done it. You guys give your feedback. Let's talk about how because we all 3 go in and put in our fab recommendations. We give our star rankings, me, myself, Kendall, and Chris Allen. We all do this every week, and then it goes into one tool. There's beauty in diversity, though, right? It doesn't force us to agree. Yes. Kendall could say someone's 3. I say they're 4. That's okay.
Yeah.
But we all are basically following these guidelines. So for me, Dontavian Wicks was a 4-star. For Kendall, it was a 3.
Yeah.
But I looked at it as I think he could take the job. I think there's also a chance that the Packers are I know it wasn't his fault. Any receiver that took the hit that Christian Watson took is getting hurt. It has nothing to do with his injury history. He's getting hurt.
Right.
But in the Packers' mind, he's been hurt a lot.
Yeah.
So I know that door is also open. So he ended up being a 4-star player for me. And then you just work your way on down to 3-star, 2-star, 1-star. 1-star really being a stopgap player. You're just trying to get through a bye week. They don't have a time horizon. They're not super talented.
Yeah.
You know, you're not keeping them long term. So that's the first part. And based on those things, a 5-star player is going to be 50% plus of your fab. Okay.
Yep.
A 4-star player it's a range. It's 25 to 49%.
Yeah.
Because there's some gray area in there. I put a 40% recommendation on Wicks. I think Kendall put 20. I think Chris Allen put 30.
Yeah.
So we all saw it a little bit differently, but once you average it together, it's a player that we still felt strongly about that's going to have an opportunity. And if it goes well for him, he could win. He could help you win your league. He could be a difference maker. Dontavian Wicks could be. So that's the first part. It's the player. And you're grading those components. Again, their talent, the opportunity they have, and then you're talking about the quality of their team, and then what's the time horizon. But then there are other two components that does make this maddening, because that scale, we say 25 to 50%. You've got to basically apply this to your league. Exactly. Number 1, self-assessment. Look in the mirror. What is your team?
Yeah.
Are you 0-4 and Rashee Rice is on your team and Puka Nakua is on your team, I say that in a complete place of freaking pain, people.
Yeah, exactly.
I have those two together. I can't tell you how many times.
Yeah.
I'm going to be even more aggressive on Dontavian Wicks. I'm 1-3. There's no time to wait around. I got to do something. And if I'm in a 12-team league with 20 roster spots, even though I said 40% in that thing, I'm going 50% and above. You can bet your bottom dollar. Like, I'm going for it. I am going for it. I'm 4-0. I'm loaded. I'm just trying to prevent the other person from getting them for cheap, right? I'm going to go to the bottom end of that range. So self-reflection. How good is your team? How bad is your team? Be honest with yourself, people. Be honest. I know sometimes that's hard. It can be painful, but you got to be honest with yourself. And then the last part, I kind of mentioned it. It's your league size and roster sizes.
Yes.
Because scarcity is totally different in an 8-team league that rosters 14 players versus a 14-team league where everyone rosters 20 and you start 3 wide receivers and 2 flex. Those are 2 separate games.
Exactly.
We're not even playing the same game anymore.
Exactly.
Right?
And we run into that a lot with quarterback stuff, right? Where people are like, "Oh, should I drop Trevor Lawrence or whoever?" Trevor Lawrence is probably a good example because he has a good matchup this week, and maybe in an FFPC environment he's probably still rostered and such. But in a regular 10-team home league, Trevor Lawrence is probably droppable in a lot of instances, right? And so it's one of those, like, you have to provide that context if you want the most accurate answer to it. And look,
go check your waiver wire.
Yeah,
if you look at Trevor Lawrence versus what else is there on your waiver wire, and he's your QB2, that's the quickest way. And you're like, oh my God, I'd have to pick up Gardner Minshew. You don't drop him.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's what I always tell people. I'm always like, go look at what's out there. If Geno Smith is out there, if those kinds of players who were in Darnold and these later round quarterbacks are sitting on your waiver wire right now who have performed well to start the season and you feel better about, then yeah, you can let him go and you can stream or whatever, right? But again, if Gardner Minshew is the alternative, then you probably don't want to get rid of Trevor Lawrence in that instance. It's really like I've tried, like, I am very, very interested / passionate about getting people to like fantasy football on the level that we like it and interact with it, right? Because it's just so important to having that, like, next level thinking and having success at the game, right? Instead of just listening to some idiot like myself or you sitting on a podcast and recommending things. You can do that at a baseline, but I get more joy out of people who are listening to, like, Living the Stream or something, and they know who the streamers are going to be ahead of time because they've done the research, they're looking at this stuff, and they understand the process. Or when people are about to listen to the sleeper show that I do, and they have a general idea of a couple of guys that I might be talking about that week. Good. That's exactly what I want. I want to do less of the straight up answering and more of this kind of dialogue, more of like the, where are things going? Where can we be better? Where are our processes right or wrong? What kind of data matters? Like, that's the deeper stuff, in my opinion, that doesn't get enough run, doesn't get talked about enough, but is way more important.
You're really good at that. Like,
thank you. I appreciate that.
You do a very good job of self-reflection. You do a very good job of analyzing your process. I can tell that you have a process to work through your process.
Yes,
like, I can tell. Yeah. I can tell that, like, your off season, whenever you get into it and you start thinking about the mistakes you made, and you're genuinely doing that work that we have to be doing. And so, I mean, I think that's like a major hat tip, to you.
Thank you.
But yeah, I would say, with the fab stuff, like we could call this episode of your show of Late Round Perspectives. It depends. Like, there's just this range. And I know people don't always like that answer, but it really does, matter. And again, like, that's what I try to tell people with that process I just walked through. Like, it's still your baseline. Yeah. You still, and sometimes, like, guys, you just understand your league. You've got 4 other players in your league that as soon as you drop Trevor Lawrence, they'll pick him up just to spite you.
Yeah.
Like, we can never know that. We can never know that. My son's really gotten into fantasy football. He just graduated college. He's just got offered a job today, JJ. My son is like, he's in finance. So he got offered a job. He's super excited. Went to Texas Tech. So he's getting super into fantasy football. And, like, he's really into it, and he comes every day and he's talking to me about these trades, talking to me about his league mates. And we get to have these more in-depth conversations of, like, how his league works, which is really cool. And because we end up certain things that I may have started as giving him a recommendation, once he shares those other facts with me and we talk through it, I'll change my mind.
Yes.
So the blanket thing I may have actually written in the utilization report that's going to apply to most leagues, once he shares everything with me and all the context about what's going on in this trade proposal or this waiver wire bid, I will change my stance some.
Yeah. And it's just, that's honestly, man, the way that I feel about like snake drafts, auction drafts especially. Like I've done podcasts and episodes strictly on like auction strategy and stuff like that. I'm not saying that there's no strategy to it. I'm saying that there's not enough attention being paid to the actual league that you're drafting in and understanding, the dollar values and the economy that's created as the draft is going on. You and I play in, the Kings Classic and such. And we did, last year we did the auction draft and whatnot. And like going in, you can have a general idea, but as things are going down, you have to adjust based on how your league mates are playing and how they're bidding on these guys. It's no different from a free agent standpoint. If you know that your league isn't active or is active, or that your league likes to overinflate the running back position, look at that stuff. Look at your history, because it's going to help you immensely save dollars down the line.
Yeah. And I do that. I mean, I'm playing in over 20 managed leagues right now across multiple sites. And like Real Time Sports, FFPC, and you can bet that early in the season, I'm basically learning the room.
Yes, exactly.
I'm paying attention to it. These tools that they have now for you guys, right when you go in to place your bids in most of these places, at the very top, I used to go look this up before I did my bids for every team. I wrote down the other teams. I wrote how much money they had spent, depending on how much I cared about this team.
Yeah, right.
It was one of my really good teams, et cetera, et cetera. I might even go back and look at some of those players' bids for a position.
Yeah.
So you can take it as far as you want. Now, when you manage 20, I can't do that for every single team. And that's why I kind of honestly, sometimes I'm like, why do I do this myself? Why don't I just do 3 that I really, really care about, that I could take this thing all the way? Well, I know why, because like I want exposure to these
you want the
players,
portfolio.
But
yeah.
So anyway, but the point being is like, you can take it as far as you want to, but a lot of these tools now are built in a way where you can easily see. So when I look at the bottom 2 teams in Fab and they're already down to like 250 each, and I go look at their rosters and they both need a running back, and I know I want a running back.
Yeah.
Normally I might have said, guys, this is 25% bid. I'm probably going to go enough to beat both of those guys for sure.
Exactly.
And then I'm figuring out how much do I have to go over that looking at these other teams.
Yes.
So there's just so much context, man.
Yeah. I mean, look, a really, really quick example of that is Tucker Kraft this past week, where we finally have a tight end that, I'm not saying he's going to be like a high-end tight end 1, but it's at least a usable piece in that offense. No Christian Watson, whatever. Luke Musgrave's also banged up. But, you go out to the waiver wire and, if you actually look across, the tight end landscape has been pretty rough, as we know.
Yeah.
But if you look across teams, there are still like 10 tight ends out there that if you have one of those tight ends, you're probably like, okay, I don't necessarily, in a normal like home league or whatever, you're like, okay, I don't necessarily have to go out and get a backup tight end or another tight end. I can probably just ride out, David Njoku's coming back, Evan Ingram's coming back. Like I can ride this out. I'll be okay. Which means your competition really isn't the 11 other teams in your league. It's the 1 or 2 other teams that desperately need that tight end that might go after a guy like Tucker Kraft, bye weeks aside, all that kind of stuff. And so as a result of that, even though your analysis might say, okay, in a normal situation, this might be a 15% to 20% bid in this league, you might even be able to bring that down a little bit based on the fact that there isn't that much competition. So like that's the kind of micro thing that you can be looking at to help with these bids each week.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about looking at all the little things and then making those adjustments. Because again, it all really comes down to scarcity and really stylistically how your league is played, how your league managers are. That's such a huge part that we can never answer. Like I almost never answer like start sit or trade questions with just an answer. Occasionally I will, like on social media, I'll just say yes or no.
Yeah.
But really like my first instinct is always just say, well, what does your bench look like?
Exactly.
What is this? What is this? What? And sometimes we don't always have time to do that. Cause if I did that for like 500 replies, like I would have less of a life than the one I already have. So yeah, but yeah, no, all really good points.
Man, this was awesome. I'm glad that like I said, so every week, just so people know, I send show sheets to the guest, and questions are about like this week
we were
gonna talk about like Breece Hall or Kareem Hunt, whatever. But I love when the discussions go this way, because I think that it's just a more like this is a conversation that you and I could have in Canton, just going back and forth. Like we would have this conversation, IRL, as opposed to being more buttoned up on like a podcast or something, talking about player takes and stuff. I think a lot more people are going to take something away from a discussion like this. So Dwain, thank you. Let everyone know where they can find you and all the great stuff that you're working on.
No, really appreciate you, number one, JJ. Thank you so much for having me on. You do great work. But yeah, folks can find me over at fantasylife.com. You guys can check out our YouTube channel. You can check out the website. Right now, utilization, you can come out and check out the utilization report. I've got the utilization score in there. And so if you want a 20% discount, you have to get the tier 2 package to have access to the utilization score. Folks, those are just the rules. Elliot Chris makes the rules. Okay. So it's UR, just the letter U, the letter R, score, and you get 20% off. So
perfect.
Brought that with me just for you today,
man.
JJ.
That's perfect. That's perfect. I look at the data suite that you guys have. It's awesome. It's a really, really nice quick reference. And you also, when you log in there, you get to see your beautiful face sitting right there, staring back at you. It's great.
I don't get some of those choices. I mean, but I'm like, yeah, I get, my kids laugh because they like come in and I use the utilization tools for all my stuff, and I've got it up and they're like, Dad, why is like you're just looking at yourself? I'm like, actually, no, I'm not. I'm just the table I'm looking at happens to be below like my stupid face.
Oh, it's so good. So good. Yeah, check all that out, fantasylife.com. You guys are doing awesome work. You guys can check out all my stuff as usual over on lateround.com, and you will be greeted with my ugly mug whenever you go do that. Check that out. Make sure you're taking advantage of the Underdog offer. That's promo code LATEROUND. You will get free rest of season rankings if you do that, if you sign up over on Underdog. But otherwise, everyone, thank you for tuning in.